There's a famous quote from Carl Jung that says, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your
Hmm.
life and you will call it fate." I guess I
Yep.
want to hear from you, Toula, what your interpretation of, or what your sense of shadow work is, and how that relates to what you're doing, and I guess a bit of your story as well.
Sure. Okay, so first of all, that quote that you just said, technically we don't know whether Carl Jung actually did say that or not because there's no actual direct reference for it. However, essentially that is the premise of his Jungian psychology, which is we have to become conscious of what's in our unconscious. And if we're not conscious of our unconscious thoughts, memories, behaviors, patterns, then it will influence our everyday life and we won't necessarily recognize the influences, but it will have an effect, a significant effect that can actually potentially affect every aspect of our lives. So for Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, very profound thinker, deep thinker, and for Jung, he said basically we have to individuate. In other words, we become an individual in our own right, and that's the goal of life. And as part of individuation, we have to conduct our own shadow work and become conscious of what's in our unconscious. Yeah.
Very succinct, thank you.
Yep.
And so, with the kind of shadow work that you're doing, and because I
Mm.
wanted to differentiate between, shadow work because it's such a huge, from what I've seen in the spiritual communities that I've been a part of, and
Mm.
different groups that are into personal development, there's
Yep.
this, collective consciousness, we'll put it to reference Carl Jung, around what
Yep.
shadow work is and what it isn't. Could you define, in
Yes.
your unique way of doing it, what it is,
Yep.
and I guess how you came upon doing it the way that you do it?
Okay, so there is regular shadow work, which is becoming conscious of the unconscious. And then there is a method that I've developed over the last 14 years. It wasn't intentional, I didn't set out to create a therapy. I just found that there's ways that we can do things a little bit better. And for me, I come from a teaching background. I used to be a teacher in schools and a guidance officer, intensive behaviour support, head of student services. And so I know the way that people learn. And so we learn through stories and images. So when I do shadow work, I actually call it SIT shadow work or story image therapy shadow work. And essentially I help people to become conscious of what's in their unconscious through using stories and images. So that's the difference between regular shadow work, which could be using stories and images. It might be using music, dance, many different other forms of media. The one that I use is stories and images to tap into the unconscious because that is the language of the unconscious. So when you think about it, you say, okay, when we dream usually, most people dream a bunch of images like a movie that tells a semi-sensible story. So stories and images is the language of the unconscious and it's universal. So that's why I use it. So you can use it for males, females, general population, just doesn't matter what age, what culture, what religious orientation, stories and images are universal. So that's why I use those.
And
Yeah.
so, if you look at some of the literature around symbolism and Freud and dreams and symbols and various things like that, is
Mm.
there a set kind of elements inside of certain images that can lead us to a certain truth, or is it rather that it's for each individual based on context?
Um, it's a good question. Okay, so first of all, I might differentiate between sign and symbol because Jung did actually make that distinction. So a sign is something that we all know. So you might see a stop sign on the road and every driver knows that they have to stop. So it has no particular personal interpretation. It's just that's what you do. A symbol is different insofar as it's an archetypal image. So, for example, you might have the rose as a symbol, and it can symbolize universally. It could symbolize love, it could symbolize the mother. So, it could symbolize a lot of different things in different cultures, but generally, It symbolizes the same sort of thing for most people, but it is open to individual interpretation depending on the person's situation. So archetypal images is a pattern or a form, it's a symbol, and then we can put our own interpretation into that archetypal form. So for example, you might have the symbol of the mother, but then there's many different types of mother. So the rose might symbolize your stepmother, it might symbolize your birth mother, it might symbolize your mother-in-law, it could symbolize a lot of different things, mother nature. So it is open to interpretation, but they are also universal. So does that make sense?
Makes absolute sense. So when
Yep.
that happens and you establish a symbol for something and you find that that means X, Y, Z, for example, the rose with the mother,
Mm-hmm.
how does that lead to a change in someone's mind? Like, just run us through kind of the roadmap around the discovery of that, and even the the pre-frame before that, and then how that is subsequently moves towards change in their life.
I'd probably use an example of how I would use it in story image therapy because I think sometimes an example can be quite useful. So, for example, okay, first of all, Jung did go through a semi-psychotic sort of break for about 5 years, and every day he would draw mandalas, which is like a circular image that had lots of different forms or patterns inside of it. And so I use a similar method in story image therapy. I'll get the person to draw an archetypal pattern, which is the symbol of the circle, representing ourself. And then I will ask the person to ask whatever questions they have from their unconscious. So, for example, if I have, let's say, a person who might be referred to me by doctors in the medical centre, and this person may have a chronic gambling habit, let's say. And so the person does a mandala, they draw a mandala, I show them how to do it. We do some deep breathing. I put on some relaxing music, and then we write down what the question is that that person wants to have answered from their unconscious. So, for example, I might say in story image therapy, I might say if the person would like to know why they keep gambling, that might be the question that they want to have answered unconsciously because they can't get the answer consciously. So we write down the question, why do I keep gambling? And then the person draws an image in the mandala, and then we analyze those images that's in the mandala to try and generate that person's gambling story. Why do they keep gambling? So that's how I tap into that person's unconscious. So it's not me that's interpreting what the images mean. It's actually the person who's done the drawing, but I can help guide them. So I'm not telling them what it means, but I'm helping them to find their own answers.
Hmm. And do you
Yeah.
feel like a lot of current psychological practices
Mm.
don't incorporate this, and rather they're kind of sitting on the conscious mind of like, this is what happened, this is the experience, and talking through the the situation as opposed to what is the source of that? Has that been your experience with traditional psychology, and is that why you've shifted
Mm.
towards is it SIT that you say SIT?
Yeah, sit. Yep, sit.
Yeah.
I call it sit for short. That's exactly right. So I've been teaching and counselling now for 30 years, so it's a long
Wow.
time. Yeah, long time. And I've found that we have to go deeper to the root cause. Just having cognitive conscious strategies is not sufficient for a person to have long-term sustainable change. So conscious strategies are fine, and I do use them with clients. You know, if we do solution focused therapy, let's say for a short term intervention because they need to know how to fix the problem right here, right now, then yes, we can do that for a short time, but it doesn't get to the root cause of the problem. It doesn't help a person to make meaning out of their suffering. It doesn't help a person to understand the trauma that they've been through. And so I find that well, neuroscience research shows that 95% of our brain's activity is actually unconscious. So it's only 5% of our brain's activity that's actually conscious. So using cognitive conscious strategies is not sufficient. So that's why I use SIT, story image therapy, to help a person to go deeper. because that's the way we get to the root cause of the problem. Where does it actually stem from? How do we actually work on, let's say, making meaning out of our suffering? Conscious strategies are not sufficient for that.
Do you feel like that the underlying layer to being human is that we live by stories, and we either have empowering stories or, and I know this is very simplistic, but we have empowering
Mm,
stories or disempowering stories. Do you
mm-hmm,
feel like when we suffer,
mm,
we have a inaccurate story perhaps that isn't guiding us along the right path? And is that
mm-hmm.
what this work is doing? It's helping us to understand A, what our story currently is, and B, what the right story might be, based on bringing that consciously to your mind.
Yes, it is that, but it's also a lot deeper than just that too. So what you're talking about is probably narrative therapy, particularly where you're sort of writing a story or you're telling yourself a particular story and then you're rewriting the story. Okay, so that's narrative therapy. And I do, I guess, incorporate certain elements of narrative therapy into SIT, but it's particularly the story through the images that I focus on. So I have the story as well as the images, both equally as important. In fact, the image oftentimes comes before the actual narration of the image. So it's the images that tells us the person's story. So it would be more a case of saying, what images has this person got in their mind? What is it that they're holding in their mind, the picture of themselves that is influencing them to have a negative story about themselves or an incorrect story. So it's very much around the stories and the images rather than just the story. Yeah.
Okay. And
Mm.
just to run right home as far as the definition goes, do you have an
Yep.
example of maybe a particularly complex or interesting story around some work you've done with someone, and what symbols were showing up, if you're able to, because it'd be
Mm-hmm.
really good to hear what
Yeah.
it's like in action.
Yep. Okay. Gee, I talk to lots of people with lots of different issues. But for example, okay, I had a very high achieving person, used to bring in $1 million contracts into their organization. So very high functioning, very high achieving person. But when we start talking and doing sit shadow work, we identify that this person actually has a very negative evaluation of themselves. In other words, they have feelings of inadequacy, feelings of inferiority. Which is not congruent with what this person's actually achieving. This person's actually very high functioning, achieving extremely well financially and in every way, but still has feelings of inadequacy. So to help that person to identify, why do I still feel inadequate when everything else is telling me that I'm actually very high functioning? Why do I continue to feel inadequate? That would be the question that we want to have answered from the unconscious. So I would use a few different methods. One method I would use would be to draw the mandala and analyze the images that the person has drawn in their mandala. So that's one thing that we would do. Another thing that we would do, for example, is once we've identified what the story is that the person's telling them themselves, I would then use, let's say, archetypal cards. So I have different cards from different cultural backgrounds, depending on what that person's background is. So if the person, let's say, has a Celtic background, then I will use cards from Norse mythology to try and tap into redirect their story. So we will look at the story of Thor, let's say, of strength, and how does, like if you look at Thor's hammer, you'd see it's that dichotomy between light and dark, between strength and compassion. So that's the symbol of Thor's hammer. And then, for example, how does that relate to this other person's story? So the symbol, for example, of when do they feel strong? When do they feel destructive? This person that I was talking about, when they drew their mandala, they actually had a symbol. They had lots of different symbols, but they had a line in the middle, and they had one side which was their persona, which is very successful, lots of money, lots of achievement, and then the other side, which was the dark, so light and dark. the dark side, which is the feelings of inadequacy. They had handcuffs themselves. They felt handcuffed. They felt chained. They had an image at the top, and I asked them what that was. And they said, well, that was the nuns that I had when I went to school. And I said, okay, how did you feel about the nuns? They said, well, they always made me feel like I wasn't good enough. So what that person had actually done was internalized the story that the nuns had told them about being inadequate from when they
Oh
were
wow.
five years old. Yeah. And so that story had continued on. So then we used Thor's hammer to try and talk to that person about how they can have, let's say, the strength to overcome the patterning that the nuns had given them when they were a child.
Wow. And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of high achievers, and myself included, there's
Mm.
this unconscious fear that if we, mess with the unconscious too much, we lose our skills. And what I mean by that is, like, in a way, inadequacies
Mm.
and insecurities drive this for certain personalities, at least from my
Mm-hmm.
experience, drive this desire for more.
Yeah.
Which, in a way, you're like, okay, well, if I change this, if I start, healing myself, quote unquote, and I
Mm-hmm.
start fixing some of these things, then maybe, I won't be as driven as I currently am. So I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
touch that. I want to leave that to the side. Has that been your experience with individuals as well? Who, I mean, obviously they're not coming in to see because they see that they feel that way. But do you
Yeah.
see that a lot in people? When they say in the past I didn't want to come because I was afraid of changing, so I might not be as driven as I previously was.
Yes.
Has that been an
Yes.
experience?
It has. It has, but generally they come to see me because they've been so driven and then they burn out and they struggle. And
Yeah.
they then realize that the patterning that they have got, the unconscious patterning, yes, it's driven them, but it's also created, it's like a vicious cycle because the person is then never contented. They're never happy with what they have, and they're driven so much to keep having more, doing more, being more, that it actually becomes counterproductive. So I talk with them about finding that balance. So it's not about not achieving, but it's about achieving in a healthy way rather than an unhealthy way. Yeah.
It's a case of the vessel breaking down. I've had this before,
Yeah.
especially in the last couple of years, where you can put as much pressure as you think you can onto the body and onto your mind, but eventually
Yeah.
there'll be
Yeah.
cracks in the vessel, so to speak, and that comes from,
Yeah.
nervous system dysregulation,
Yeah.
IBS,
Yeah.
broken sleep, which then leads to a host of other problems. And then
That's
you start
right.
thinking to yourself, like, what am I, why is my body doing this to me? And you start to then think it's the body, when
Mm.
really it's the pressure you've been putting yourself since you're maybe a kid from these stories you tell yourself. So I can see how it comes full circle, kind of like a
Yeah.
snake eating its own tail, so to speak, speaking about
Yeah.
symbolism.
Yes, that's right. The Uribos is true. Yeah, look, I'll give you an example because actually what you're talking about is very true. I had another very high achieving individual whose company used to get awards, regular awards. Okay. And the person was so driven to achieve and everything was going extremely well, but would get the award, wouldn't really appreciate the award, and was just sort of waiting for the next one. So there was no actual gratitude for what that person had actually achieved. And so we're starting to go back, and I'm saying, okay, so this is when we start moving into adolescent shadow work, but doing it through stories and images. So when we go back, we find that this person, as a teenager, as a 14-year-old young man, decided that he didn't want to be like his parents, like his father's family. They were not very high achieving, unemployed, and decided that they would rather be like the mother's family, where they were in business and they were doing very well, successfully, financially, etc. And so they made a distinction at 14 that they wanted to be like the mother's family and very much not want to be like the father's family. So that drove them for the rest of their adolescence and and adult years to not want to be like the father's family. But they didn't realize that that pattern had continued for 20 plus years, that they were still repeating that same pattern. So they'd gotten into a habit of achieving but not appreciating the achievement. because they were so driven not to be like the father's family. But they didn't realize that until we did sit shadow work and looked at the root cause of where that actual drive came from.
Wow,
So
that's so
you're,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It is fascinating. Yeah. And it's much, for me, it's much more holistic than just regular cognitive conscious strategies. It's just, we need to have a deeper understanding of ourselves. Um, I also do bring in the spiritual and the philosophical aspects of a person's life to try and help them to get the balance between the physical, mental, emotional. And so I often will go to that spiritual or philosophical place, whatever that is for that person. And so I talk about the bed of life symbol
Hmm.
and having those four bedposts in alignment. So Jung said high spirit conquers low spirit. He was talking particularly about addictions. That's where Alcoholics Anonymous originated or was inspired by Jung, and that's why it has a spiritual focus. Okay, but I bring in the spiritual, but it's whatever that is for that person. So I don't come from any religious perspective. I'm not trying to push any religious views onto anyone, but I do know that a connection to the spirit of ourselves, the spirit of others, or the spirit of the world around us is necessary, or developing some kind of philosophical view on life is necessary for us to rise above the physical, mental, emotional.
But it
Yeah.
also
So,
seems as well like individuals who are so strung up on science approach. I'm not saying this is not scientific because I
mm,
hear that in that, but what I'm saying is that there's individuals who, and this is me, I'm speaking to this part of myself as well, where it needs to
yep.
be based in science. It needs to be like tidy and
Yes.
put into a box and neat and, like step
Yep.
one, two,
Yep.
three, four, five. And it's almost
Yep.
like that itself is a shadow in itself. It's like I
Mm.
need
Mm-hmm.
it's like a fear of the uncertainty, and uncertainty has led to pain in the past, and therefore anything that seems slightly ethereal, or is attached
Mm-hmm.
to a label of spirituality, which most people associate with some kind of uncertainty and wiggliness. It's like Alan Watts says. He
Mm-hmm.
says you have the prickly
Mm.
people, then you have the wiggly
Yep.
people. Like the prickly ones are
Yep.
like sharp and rigid and like needs to be like this,
Yep.
and the wiggly people are like whatever, let's just do whatever. It
Yeah.
almost seems
Yep.
like the scientism of science it drives
Yep.
people away from actually making the change they need to have a more holistic view.
Yes, look, I don't have a problem with the scientific approach, and actually, I endorse that. I think
Mm.
it's important that we know that whatever it is that we're doing is grounded in research, does have a good evidence base to say that it's effective, because that way we know that what we're doing is actually going to be working. So that's why I've done research on sit shadow work. So, like I said to you before, it started 14 years ago when I was working in schools. I was working as a head of student services and working with the most complex cases of over 6,000 youth in 3 high schools. And it was a position that was created for me. And it was a very difficult job. I did it to the best of my ability, but I had a lot of cases of trauma. And when you've got situations where you've got issues in your own adolescent shadow that you don't necessarily recognize, you find that cognitive methods, science-based methods, are not sufficient to explain why you're getting triggered. And that's what was happening with me in my job. I was getting triggered, and regular cognitive behavior therapy wasn't enough for me to understand why. So the scientific method, as valuable as it is, it's inadequate for things like trauma, feelings of rejection, inadequacy, powerlessness. You can't just reason out those emotions. It's not sufficient.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's a way of escaping the actual problem, like because it's hard to face those
Yep.
problems.
Yes.
I did parts work about a year and a half ago, and for the longest time I went and saw a psychologist who
Mm.
I'd approach the conversation to, I guess, well, I mean, not, I guess I was
Mm.
upfront putting up a barrier of intellect and intelligence
Mm-hmm.
to hide away
Mm-hmm.
from being exposed in a way, right? And this
Sure.
individual, and I knew I did that. I knew that was a pattern of mine because I'd
Mm.
seen psychologists in
Mm.
the past, and I've always been
Yep.
driven to want to change. And I'd see psychologists in the past, and I'd do this kind of pattern. And I went to this one psychologist, and I got a podcast with him, Andrew Sozominio, and I said to
Mm,
him when I first arrived there, "Hey, a pattern of mine is
mm,
that I will intellectualize this, and to show you that I
mm-hmm.
understand my problems more than you understand them, and therefore you
Yep,
leave feeling impressed, and then there's no problem here. We move on. You confirm this reality of myself, and then I make no change." He said, "Okay, I recognize that." So every time I did
yep.
that, he would just note that and break the pattern, and I started doing
Oh,
parts
yeah.
work, and for the first time, not for the
Mm,
first time, for one of the most physiologically and psychologically intense changes. Like, 'cause I felt the pressure, like not the pressure of stress to change or to be a certain way, but the pressure of like
mm.
confronting these parts of myself that they didn't know were there, and like these really like
Yep,
gruesome images and gruesome
yep.
ideas and thoughts, and I just had
Mm,
to say them out loud, and because I wanted to make that change, and I was saying things to him that is confidential, but like things that would
mm.
I would never say in public, and he's like, "I
Yep,
see that." So and
yep.
I so then I realized at that point that a lot of the and I love to ask about why we do this, but a lot of the patterns that I had in my life were a way to avoid that feeling of
Mm,
confrontation.
mm.
Is that what is that? Is that a common thing in humans, or is that just me, or like what is that out of humans that we try to avoid? Those things that are really going to make us confront something.
I think it's a defense mechanism, but we all have to get through life. We can't just wear our heart on our sleeve or just talk about our unconscious constantly. We have to have a persona. We have to have a mask, an image that we present to the world, and that's fine. And Jung said that's the ego, that's the conscious mind that we all sort of share and we all engage in on a daily basis, and that keeps us balanced and keeps us functioning in the world. But there does also need to be the counterbalance where we get in touch with that shadow part of ourselves, the dark part of our personality, the part that we have kept hidden or repressed or we don't even recognize. We at some point in our life, we will get triggered. If we've got something in our shadow and we don't necessarily know what that is until we get triggered, and we will act in an irrational way. And usually, what I find is if it started in a person's, let's say, childhood, the shadow started in the childhood, but then it usually magnifies in their teenage years. So, feelings of inadequacy or rejection or whatever, they tend to magnify, they tend to be bigger as a teenager. And if people are prone to a mental health condition, it'll come out in their mid to late teens or their early 20s. That's what the research shows.
Wow.
So that's why I go back to the adolescent years in particular and I focus on those and help the person to get in touch with what I call their universal adolescent. So we change the image from their wounded adolescent, so whatever it is that hurt them as an adolescent, let's say that they suppressed, that's a complex in their shadow, and it will come out in adulthood until they work on it. And so it doesn't matter. You can be 28, 38, 58, and you can get triggered by stuff that's in your shadow from generally your adolescent years. That's what I find.
Well, and
So
just
we have to
just
do it.
yeah, and just on that, like, and
Mm.
I know I'm going all over the place here, but just on that,
All right.
so my brother, he's 15 now, and he's going through that stage of being really rebellious and perhaps doing some
Yep.
nefarious things that
Yep.
one wouldn't desire a kid to do. Um,
Mm.
he doesn't want, well, as far as I can see, right, there's no
Mm.
desire to change. And we see this
Yep.
through individuals as well. Like there's a lack of, or not a lack of, but not a wanting to actually change. They're okay with the way they want to be,
Mm.
which maybe that's
Mm.
fine. What do you
Mm.
do in cases where, a teenager, for example, we can
Yep.
extrapolate from this, adults as well
Yep.
that are listening,
Mm.
but when it comes to a teenager who, their parents send them saying like, "I need you to look at this," but they don't want to they want to have any change. How do you approach that first and foremost? And by extension, how can an adult approach that if they have a partner or something similar
Mm.
who's doing
Mm.
something like a similar kind of attitude?
Yep. Look, it's a good question. Sometimes parents will refer a young person to me and they'll say, "Here, fix them." Okay. If that young person doesn't think that there's anything wrong, then I've got Buckley's of being able to get them to have any level of real insight because they're just not ready. So the person does have to be ready, and generally they're not ready until they've been through a fair bit of pain. So if they're still 15 and mucking around, let's say with drugs or whatever. I mean, I used to run drug education groups in schools. And so I would have the grade 11s selling drugs to the grade 9s. Okay. So I would try and run drug education, and the principal said, fix them, do something. And I'm going, okay, well, so I ran drug education groups with these young people. Now, if I just tried to say to them, just you need to stop doing your drugs, and I try and come down from an authoritarian perspective, they would tell me where to go. Okay, I would have absolutely no effect. So what did work though, and this is where story image therapy sort of evolved, is I found the most effective thing was to use SPECT scans. Have you ever heard of SPECT scans?
I have.
SPECT, yeah. So it shows the blood flow around the brain. And so I used the story of the 16-year-old young man who had been smoking marijuana for 2 years. And you can actually see on the SPECT scan, you can see the frontal lobes where there's no, it looks like a hole in the frontal lobes where there's actually no blood flow. And I tell them the story, how the father was a GP and how he was concerned about his son because his son couldn't concentrate, he couldn't remember, he couldn't focus, he couldn't learn new information. And so then the father eventually got the son a scan, a SPECT scan, and they showed that through chronic use of marijuana, daily use for 2 years, he ended up with no blood flow in the prefrontal lobes. So that story and that image of the SPECT scan had far more effect than me trying to tell them what to do. So that's where the stories and the images, and that's, as I say, that's sort of the evolution of SIT came from, was through me finding, just through my own sort of, I call it Jungian action research. So action research is where you try a method and then you analyze the results, you discuss it with the person, and then you try another method or try to improve it, and then you discuss the results with the person, and then you try and improve it again. So it's cyclical action research that I was doing in the schools, and then also in private practice with adults, and finding the same thing. The stories and the images consistently came up as the way that we change human behavior.
Wow.
Yeah, that's why I use stories and images. Yeah.
And when it came to ADHD, because I'm sure you've seen a lot of that, especially in,
Yep.
it almost seems like it's, there's probably many reasons for it, but it seems almost a part of growing up these days. So there's Gabor Mate who talks about a lot of trauma-based, information and approaches and things like that. And he says that
Yep.
ADHD is from when kids, and this is me paraphrasing massively here, but from when kids have no choice to get out of their suffering other than to split their attention in many directions, which then begins the habit of ADHD. Do you agree with that analysis? And what is your approach on ADHD, generally speaking?
I don't know that I agree with that 100% because there are people that I see, young people, adults, older adults with ADHD that haven't necessarily got a trauma history. So I don't think that we can say it's all a splintered personality or it's a personality that's sort of broken off in response to trauma. But certainly some people with ADHD would have that sort of trauma background. Certainly, I acknowledge that, no problem. The other thing I do find, which is another interesting one, I haven't done any research on it, but I would be curious to know people who have a trauma background. I find a lot of them are actually highly intuitive because they've had to develop they've had to be highly sensitive to environmental stimuli in case something, if they upset someone or whatever. So they're often highly intuitive. And so in terms of spiritual awakening and spiritual awareness, oftentimes they are actually very spiritually evolved as a result of the trauma. So I find that very interesting as well. And the research actually does show that people who have some spiritual or philosophical understanding of life actually do have better mental health. So one of my hypotheses would be perhaps they've developed that spiritual side of themselves, that intuitive side of themselves to cope with the trauma. So that's another theory, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because it seems that the more sensitive you are, like you said, the more you are aware or awakened to spirituality.
Mm.
So it's almost like you need to
Yeah.
almost suffer to get to that. Is that true, do you think, or is that just another story?
No, I actually think where there's light, there has to be dark. Where there's dark, there has to be light. So where there's pain, there's an opportunity to learn or an opportunity to grow. I mean, if you think about when you were learning to walk, okay, or your brother, you probably observed your brother, okay, learning to walk. So he would have had, let's say, lost his balance and toppled over, hurt himself, and then he's had to sort of get up and find his balance again, and he might have, toppled over again, but gradually, through the pain, he learns how to find his balance. So we can't have the day without the night. We can't have the summer without the winter. We can't have the learning or the personal growth without the pain and the problems. So that's one of the things that I do in story image therapy is help people to see the light, which is the lessons, out of the
Hmm.
dark.
Wow.
Yeah. Hmm.
And if someone were to do this approach by themselves, is there a methodology or a way of doing this that would allow them to do it by themselves? Is it like journaling? Is there dream journaling? Or would you not recommend any of that?
I think dream journaling is excellent. Sometimes people don't necessarily know quite how to analyze their dreams. I
Hmm.
mean, Jung was certainly an expert. He analyzed over 2,000 of his own dreams,
Wow.
and journaled it, etc. I actually have done my own sit shadow work and journaling my journey of being triggered. So I was triggered in my job when I was 38, and I had feelings that were reminiscent of when I was a teenager. So I had very difficult teenage years. And when I was in my job, I got triggered by the things that I hadn't worked through as a teenager, because most teenagers don't want to work through their stuff. And it's not until later that we recognize the complexes in our shadow. And that's what happened to me at 38. And then 10 years later, at 48, I had the similar feelings coming back again. So again,
Mm.
my complexes in my shadow were triggered. And that's when I got really interested and started to develop sit shadow work. And so I actually started journaling my journey of healing. And that became my second book. It wasn't intentional. I didn't set out to write a book. The journaling that I did as part of my own healing process is what became that book. So I've actually got step by step how I've done that in my second book. It's called The Rise of Jung in Me.
Hmm. Yep.
And I've also got 6 case studies of how I've done story image therapy, sit shadow work with young people to heal their complexes as well in their shadow. So
Wow.
that's also in the book. Yeah.
And if it's okay with you, would you mind just giving us a quick overview of those 6 steps? Just a brief one, two, three, four, five, six.
Well, they were 6 case studies of
Oh, sure.
individuals that I had counselled, and they were kind enough, young people, kind enough to allow me to share their story with others. Obviously, all identifying information was removed, but they're sharing their story of their own healing process using sit shadow work. So that's in The Rise of Jung in Me as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
So, yeah.
So if someone were to analyze their dreams, for example, like I had
Yeah.
a bunch of weird dreams last night, and I think that we all do.
Mm.
Whether or
Yep.
not we remember all of them is another story. Um,
Sure.
do you recommend? I'm just going to go through some myths, or rather some principles I've heard about shadow work, and maybe we can clarify them or make them a bit clearer. So, uh,
Sure.
one of the narratives I've heard is that, or the stories or the ways of doing things, is that you first thing in the morning when you have these dreams that you remember, just write them down.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the
Mm-hmm.
best way to start to tap into the unconscious, or is that not true?
Yes, if you could remember them. A lot of people find it very difficult. In fact, the brain actually does that on purpose so that we forget the contents of the dream, so that we can start anew the next day. So it's kind of interesting. So unless you're in a half asleep state, you won't actually remember the dreams. So to try and write it down when you're half asleep can be a little bit tricky. Some people are really fortunate. They have lucid dreaming and they can remember all the details of their dream. They can actually direct their own dream, etc. So for them, I think dream journaling is a lot easier, perhaps. But certainly if you can remember them, or even just put them on a voice recorder, just on your phone, just press record. And if you're half asleep, you can just talk into the voice recording. And then later you can start to analyze your dreams. I do dream analysis with people in sit, but again, I'm not telling them what they should think that the dream means. It's like I say to people, it's like you're driving the car and I'm the nav man. I'm guiding them and showing them how to do it, but I'm not actually doing it for them. So yeah, I use it's a tool that's online. It's a very accessible resource. It's called Dream Moods Dictionary. And I use that with people. We analyze the symbols in their dream. So let's say, for example, if they dreamed about death, the concept of death, okay, that could be a tricky one for some people. Sometimes people worry that there's going to be a death, their own death or someone else's death, and I'll say to them, look, it doesn't mean that this is a prophetic dream. The death is a symbol of something else. It could be, let's say, it's the symbol of something coming to an end, a new beginning, So you're looking at specifically the symbolism of whatever that thing is. And you can use Dream Moods Dictionary to do that. Yeah, so that's good.
And do you feel like words often so they say that words are like fingers pointing to the moon, right? They're not the moon itself, but it points to what the moon might be. Do you think that sometimes we can get lost in words, especially those, how would you say, intellectual types who want to use words precisely? Do you feel like that doesn't tell the whole story? And that actually holds us back sometimes?
It can. It can. I actually use words in the form of storytelling as what we call bibliotherapy. So when I did my doctorate, I actually wrote a young adult mythic fantasy novel, which I now use in sit shadow work. So people will tell the story of their, they will read the story and put their own story into it. So as they're reading about the characters and what the characters went through in the story, I'll ask them to journal at the same time. So they're reading at the same time as they're actually making a few notes. And then once they have finished that chapter, I'll then ask them to go back and any emotions that they had. So if they were reading a passage in the novel and they got an emotion of anger or sadness or just any emotion whatsoever as they're reading the novel, I ask them to just jot it down. And then when they come back at the end of the chapter, they then start to drill it down and go deeper into why did I feel sad when I read that passage? Or what was it about that scene from the story that made me feel uncomfortable? So they're starting to drill down through the words, but it's particularly the images that the words gives them or the emotional reaction that they have to that image. And so that's how I do bibliotherapy in sit.
And I think that each word has a different meaning and felt sense for everyone. Like if someone speaks another language, and they start to learn English, for example, there's a much different felt sense with the words as opposed to speaking their natural native language. So I think words mean things to other people. And what I feel is that a way to connect with the shadow or with, using my own terminology, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is to understand, to indirectly speak to the unconscious as opposed to trying to directly get there, using storytelling, using symbolism, using different ways of like images and drawing and things like that to actually tap into that and to bypass the conscious mind, so to speak, or like the executive thinking.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. I'll give you an example because, as I say, sometimes examples are quite useful of what you're saying in terms of how different people interpret the same thing, perhaps. So, just as an example, okay, so I had two clients around the same time. One was a young person who was almost legally blind. Okay, so they just needed one more operation, and if that operation was not successful, then they would be considered legally blind. So, that person used to listen to a lot of audiobooks because they couldn't read. Okay, at the same time, I also had a gentleman who was actually referred by his parole officer. So he had held up a service station,
Hmm.
and the parole officer had referred him to me for counselling. And so he had very low literacy levels. Okay, so both individuals couldn't read for whatever reason, and so I've got my novel as an audiobook as well. It's called Shadows of Silverheim. Silverheim meaning our unconscious, and shadows of our unconscious. Okay, so I've got it as an audio book. And I actually had these two people, the two gentlemen, one that, as I say, was almost legally blind, the other one that had held up a service station and wasn't very literate. Okay, and both of them listened to the audio book. They listened to the first chapter of the audio book, and the one that was legally blind, I asked him to write down how he felt about the chapter, and he wrote down when he was listening how he felt about certain scenes. And so for him, he focused on the scene where I've got the character Jack is playing on the PS4, playing God of War with his friends and smoking weed in the garage. And this person that was listening to the audiobook said, I got triggered by that. And I said, okay, what was it about that triggered you? And they said, I realized
Mm.
listening to the audiobook how much time I had wasted in my life doing the weed and you know, just mucking around with friends. The one that held up the service station didn't pick up on the smoking marijuana at all, and picked up on the scene where the father is complaining in the kitchen, and I've got parent-child conflict in the novel, and they picked up on that, and they said that triggered them. And I said, okay, what was it about that triggered you? And they said, well, I had a father that was always complaining. Nothing was ever good enough. So that was my way of tapping into their unconscious through the story. The images in the story triggered them, but they were triggered by different things. So one had issues with recreational drug use, and that triggered their complex, and the other had issues with a negative father complex, and that is what was triggered through listening to the audiobook. Same chapter in the audiobook, but both picked up on very different parts of the story. So that just explains what you were saying before about how different people have different interpretations, and you've got to bypass the conscious mind and go to the unconscious through the stories and the images.
It's so
Yep,
fascinating how people have different responses to different things. And
yep,
I think half the issue is, or rather, half the problem is that we force our version of what reality is onto someone else, and we
yep.
feel like we need that someone feels same way we do about something when it's completely different for them.
That's right.
Um, and different experiences, different life
Hmm.
situations and upbringings, and it changes everything.
Mm. Well, it also gives me a guide to know where to target the counselling. So instead
Hmm.
of me, let's say cognitive behavior therapy is very prescriptive, right? It says this is what you do, session one, session two, these are the things that you do to try and help a person change their patterns of thinking. And if you change their thoughts, you can change their feelings and you can change their behavior. The trouble is every person is different. And so a one size fits all approach doesn't work. So, because each person's experience is different, what's in their complexes in their shadow is different. So, I can't say this is what you should do or this is what we need to concentrate on, because it depends on what's in their shadow as to what we need to focus on. So somehow we've got to tap into their shadow, find out what the actual deep-seated issues are, and then work with that. So that's where the stories and the images are useful, because they can guide me in terms of what do I need to focus on. Make sense?
Makes perfect sense. And where can, if
Mm.
people want to find out more about your
Yep.
books and potentially even work with you in the future,
Sure.
do you have courses that you do and various things like that, or?
Yeah, so now I'm starting to run workshops for people to do their own sit shadow work.
Great.
I'm writing my third book now called Frog and the Scorpion in the Boardroom. And that's actually for professionals and corporate because I'm getting a lot more of those clients who are stressed out, burnt out, miserable, and needing to work on their own unconscious issues to help them to be more productive. So it's very interesting where sit shadow work is actually going. It started off working with adolescents and trying to help the youth, but it's actually seems to now be moving more into an adult direction and sort of helping high achieving professionals, which is interesting. So I'm just going wherever it needs to go. Whoever it can help the most is where I will just take it. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm
Absolutely.
at.
And for anyone listening, I'll put all those links below in the description on the podcast, on the YouTube video as well, so they can find you there.
Sure.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with myself and everyone listening?
I think if anybody is struggling, most likely they've got unconscious issues, complexes in their shadow, and unless they actually do take the time, it's not easy, it's not fun, it's actually quite confronting. But unless you do it, it really will direct your life. Your unconscious will direct your life, and you'll call it fate. So it's absolutely vital if you want to be the best version of yourself that you can. Yeah.
Thank you, Toula. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Luke. Okay. All right.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Getting Mental podcast. If you like this episode, then you'll love this one here and this one here. Check them out.